Welcome to Coffee and Regs.
When it comes to developing an ESG action plan, some steps that a CCO can take are, first, let's get smart and really understand the issue. CCOs need to have a solid working knowledge on the topic and be conversant on ESG issues. Don't think of ESG as another investment strategy that lives in the black box of portfolio management, but is really an integral part of the advisor's business. Next, look at your firm's governance and ESG strategies. Is there a robust dialogue that involves portfolio management, sales, marketing, and compliance? Think about whether you should have a formal committee, which can depend on the size of your organization, how remote the workforce is, and how well you guys communicate amongst each other. Next, ensure that the ESG inputs are captured and documented. If your firm uses third-party data, document how that data is used in the decision-making process and what role any internal research plays. A lot of times we see third-party data that rates a company on a number of ESG factors. Well, the advisor can apply different weights to each factor to come up with their own conclusions. As a CCO, you need to be reviewing marketing materials and disclosure for consistency and to ensure that they reflect what's actually happening. So this includes any filings that are made with ESG standards bodies like the UNPRI. It's really critical here that a firm walks the talk. Final action step is that a firm needs to conduct a robust review of their ESG policies and procedures. Consider engaging a third party to give you an independent look at the controls around the investment process, operations, and client communications. So Victoria, is there a particular asset threshold that triggers when an advisor has to start thinking about these kinds of issues?
That's a great question, Matt. And before I answer it, I think it's important to put some context around my response. And by that, I mean there's a lot of regulatory activity going on in regard to ESG. It's a hot button, and it's a hot button because our population as a whole is becoming more ESG aware. And so they're asking for advisors to consider ESG criteria in managing their money. And up until recently, we hadn't heard a ton from the regulators, but they're making up for lost time. This year alone, we've seen the creation of the Climate and ESG Task Force, part of the SEC's Division of Enforcement, with a dedicated focus on developing initiatives to proactively identify ESG-related misconduct. There's some rulemaking on the Commission's agenda, specifically relating to disclosures on human capital management, including topics such as demographics and diversity, as well as climate-related disclosures. And there was an SEC risk alert in April issued by the Division of Examinations. This particular risk alert included observations from recent examinations of firms that offer ESG products and services, and also offers insight into how ESG practices are being evaluated during exams. So with the regulatory framework in mind, I'd say you should be thinking about ESG on some level, regardless of the firm's level of ESG assets, but what you need to do beyond that really depends. So now I'm not saying that to specifically avoid answering your question. I really think it does depend, and it's not really based on a dollar amount or percentage of AUM that can be classified as ESG related investments. For example, anyone can go out and buy shares of Tesla, Microsoft, Zoom, or umpteen other securities that might align with ESG principles, but many people make those investments for other reasons without even considering ESG. So my point being, individual companies and even funds that meet your firm's investment screening process might just so happen to also have high scores in various ESG categories. If that's the percentage of AUM you're talking about, I don't think you need to do that much from a compliance perspective. On the other hand, if you're at 1% or any other number, and the firm has developed model portfolios that incorporate various ESG screens and factors into the stock picking process, then you're in the game. In addition, if you're talking about ESG investing as part of your process in marketing materials, regulatory filings, DDQs, RFPs, your UNPRI, any of those communications, you really need to start putting pen to paper and drafting policies and procedures. And if your marketing materials and other communications claim that you offer ESG strategies or incorporate ESG screens, those communications better match what is actually happening in the investment process. So it's really, really critical. I mentioned the risk alert earlier, and it noted a number of deficiencies from recent examinations. Starting with the one that always gets you, some firms completely or significantly failed to address ESG in their compliance programs while offering ESG strategies. Portfolio management practices were inconsistent with disclosures about the firm's specific ESG approaches. There were also issues with controls that were inadequate to maintain, monitor, and update clients' ESG-related investment guidelines and restrictions. Proxy voting that appeared inconsistent with the advisor's stated approaches was another issue. And in marketing materials, again, going back to this, there are problems with inconsistencies between actual firm practices versus what the marketing materials said the firm was doing. They also found deficiencies in unsubstantiated or potentially misleading claims regarding firms' ESG approaches. So I do want to mention that over in the European Union, disclosure-related rules have already started phasing in particular, the Sustainable Finance Disclosure Regulation, or SFDR, came into effect in March. And SFDR focuses on increasing transparency on the degree to which financial products have ESG characteristics, invest in sustainable investments, or have sustainable objectives. It's designed to make it easier for investors to distinguish and compare between the many sustainable investing strategies that are now available. And it's further intended to help direct capital towards those sustainable activities and prevent greenwashing. To accomplish this, investment firms, asset managers, and other market participants are now subject to expanded disclosure and reporting requirements. So there's definitely a lot going on from a regulatory perspective. And I think here in the States, we should really be paying attention to those developments across the pond. Matt, can you offer some additional insights into the tools available to a CCO to get a sense of where the firm is with respect to their ESG strategies?
Sure. It really comes down to assessing where you are and where you need to be. And as I said earlier, it really is all about walking the talk and making sure that your disclosures match what you're actually doing.
This has been another episode of Coffee and Regs.